Great. All right. So first of all, thanks for joining us. Um, I'm Maura Sanchi. I'm the nursery and volunteer coordinator at Wild Seed Project, and I'm going to be facilitating the discussion today. Um, Joined here by Emily Baisden and Tyler Refsland. Tyler is the manager of applied ecology and lead author of the guide this year, and Emily Baisden is our seed center director and a contributing author. As some of you might already know, Wild Seed Project is a Maine-based nonprofit dedicated to restoring biodiversity in our landscapes through education and the distribution of native seeds and plants. So we're exceptionally excited to share with you this year's annual publication, Gardening for Biodiversity, Native Plants of the Northeast. We're going to keep this Q&A style. So we'll start off with some questions that were sent in ahead of time for people who couldn't join us. But if any of you with us today have any questions you want to ask, please put those in the Q&A function, then I can better sort through them. And you can put your reactions in the chat. If you have any tech issues, those can go in the chat as well, and I'll try to address them. We do have closed captioning, so you can enable that in your settings if you need it. And we are recording our webinar. So if you aren't able to join us live or if you want a recording, that'll be sent out after the program ends. I think that's all of the housekeeping we have. So before we get straight into the program, just want to start by saying my home, where I'm joining from today, in Biddeford, is located within ancestral Abenaki and Wabanaki territory, now called Maine. This time of year, the trees are just about to leaf out, engulfing us in a world of vibrant pinks, yellows, and greens, and it's gorgeous. We at Wild Seed Project recognize the inherent sovereignty of the tribes where we live and work: the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn, the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians, the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Penobscot Nation, and the Passamaquoddy tribe. We support their continued work for justice, self-determination, and decolonization. The work of Wild Seed Project is necessary precisely because of the ongoing violence of settler colonialism, the exploitative practices of European colonizers, which continue to this day, are directly responsible for the displacement of the native plants that form the foundation of local food webs that we're working to restore. What does it mean to build and rebuild reciprocal relationships with people, plants, fungi, soil, water, and air? Reestablishing resilient ecosystems in which all forms of life can thrive is one piece of deconstructing a colonial legacy. As we do our work at Wild Seed Project, we are clear this knowledge and information did not start, nor will it end with us. The resources we share are from many generous teachers, both human and non-human. We're committed to ongoing learning and growth and encourage you to join us in learning more about the historical and present-day relationships of Indigenous communities to the place you live, and in supporting Indigenous-led efforts to protect the land, water, plants, and creatures among us. If you're located here in Maine, Wabanaki Reach is a great group to support. I'll put a link to their website in the chat so you can explore that more. And if you're joining us from somewhere else, I'll also provide a link that will help you learn about the Indigenous communities in your area. And as I said before, we're always learning and changing. So if you have any advice or feedback, this is kind of a living document speech. So feel free to reach out and let us know. Great, I'll just pop those resources into the chat. But otherwise, we can get started on our program. So Tyler and Emily, do you guys want to take a minute to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'll go first real quick and then Tyler can kick it off. I'm Emily Baisden. I'm living in Brunswick at the moment. This is Fluff. We tried a lot of different names for her, and Fluff is the one that stuck. My 15-year-old kitty. I'm the seed center director, as Maura said. My background is in entomology and environmental science. So, spoiler alert, to have bugs, you need plants. And that's why I'm here at Wild Seed Project.
I'm Tyler Refsland, manager of applied ecology at Wild Seed Project, and my background is in ecology, plant ecology. So anything plants is very fascinating to me, and yeah, excited to get to all your questions. And oh, Mara, you're on
Cool. Real quick, can you try to unmute yourself?
Yes,
Great.
unmuted.
Second. All right. Um, Tyler, if you want to go ahead working through your slides, I think that's a good place to start.
Sounds good. Yeah, so we'll get to your questions very soon here, but just to sort of set the stage. If you're not familiar, our guide this year, Gardening for Biodiversity, will be available through our online store on May 8th. If you are not a member and haven't already received a copy, look for it out there. Um, okay. And really, I just want to say a few things about the criticalness of biodiversity for expanding wildlife habitat, you know, supporting our local food webs, and building climate resilience and resilience to other things going forward. And one example that I love to use is goldenrod, um, a species that we take for granted, but provides so many important services to wildlife and biodiversity. So even just replacing a monocultured lawn with something like a single species of goldenrod can provide for so many different critters. So on the left, the sort of bulb-like things you see on the stem of the goldenrod are goldenrod galls. And this little fly here creates them. There's a chemical in the fly larva's saliva that induces the plant to create this little home of sorts that the larva can grow in, and basically a little protected buffet. And that single relationship between the fly and the plant um, it kind of creates this whole web of other relationships, whether it's the parasitoid wasp that um, parasitizes the fly larva, or there's also a beetle and another parasitoid wasp, and there's two bird species, downy woodpecker and black-capped chickadee, that both will peck into the little gall and feed on the fly larva. So I just, as an ecologist, this is kind of a pretty classic example of a food web all contained within sort of a single plant. And just one very clear example of how reintroducing, repopulating our landscapes with native plants has pretty profound effects for biodiversity. And, that is just one part of one plant. Of course, our gardens, we try and promote many different species. And by doing so, it benefits pollinators, it benefits herbivores like caterpillars of butterflies and moths, as well as soil biodiversity, which often doesn't get talked about enough. So, all these different relationships we're trying to promote by changing our practices in our gardening. And with this year's guide, what we really wanted to sort of stress is, on one hand, you can just try and maximize the number of species in your yard, and in some ways, you'll kind of get a lot of the species that are important in different ways. But I find it a lot more sort of gratifying and connecting to understand why biodiversity benefits wildlife and, help support habitat by understanding the sort of different dimensions of diversity and how we can kind of try and bring different dimensions into our gardens so that we're kind of supporting a variety of different life and building sort of a well-rounded resilience to climate extremes and other stressors. So one thing we talk about as one dimension is what we call plant lifestyles. So whether a plant is an early establisher like jewelweed, where it puts a lot of energy into reproduction and is sort of this, you know, disturbance loving plant that takes advantage of those situations, or whether it's a keen competitor like different sunflowers, like this woodland sunflower here that puts a lot of energy into, growing and competing with other plants, or resource scavengers, which might be shade tolerant, like this Virginia bluebell, which is a spring ephemeral that takes advantage of that short window before canopy leaf out that can take advantage of the sunlight and then go dormant by later in the summer. Or plants that do well with really nutrient poor soil or other sort of stressful conditions that other plants don't do well in. So this is just an example of how kind of thinking about these buckets and thinking about your next plant decision and how to pick things that probably will best complement each other in a garden is one useful tactic to use. And another thing, of course, that we talk about is the different pollination strategies. So the different flower shapes and smells and colors that plants employ to attract different pollinators and other wildlife. And as this beautiful illustration from our artist this year, Julian Plum, shows, we have bowl-shaped flowers like roses that are really open and accessible to a lot of different insects like beetles. Um, Composite flowers, so your asters, your goldenrods, your coneflowers that have a lot of individual flowers packed into a compound flower head, which means that flowering goes on for a longer period of time because each of those little florets will flower sort of over a prolonged period of time. And so it's really valuable for nectar and pollen for a bunch of different generalists and specialists. And your tube-shaped flowers, which are loved by hummingbirds, and various other ones like dogwoods that there's a lot of specialist pollinators that feed on the pollen of dogwoods. So all of these different native plants each have their role to play, and thinking about, you know, you don't have to have all these different kinds, but it's both rewarding to know these sort of little fun tidbits about when we plant native plants, the relationships that they're creating, as well as like, okay, I want to benefit beetles and not just bees, or I want to, think about increasing the diversity a little bit of my backyard. And last slide before questions. Just some other practical things. Oftentimes we say, aiming for something like 3 to 15 species is a good goal for a lot of different garden sizes because it's, 3 gives you the starting point of diversity, and 15 starts to get to that point where, at least for a smaller space, to make a garden visually cohesive, once you get over 15, it can start to be a challenge. But species that are those different lifestyles, the different flower shapes and colors, as well as height. So this image here is showing the sort of tiers, the different layers that you can create in a forest. You can even create in a meadow. Those layers are so important for creating habitat for different wildlife. And then going along with the not trying to pack too many species in, it's really useful to have clusters of the same species because that having, a bunch of Monarda flowering at the same time is a really good billboard to attract pollinators because it's enough bang for their buck. There's a lot of the same flower type with a lot of the same food to forage, versus going yard to yard, finding a single flower is a lot less efficient for the pollinator. Um, and then near and dear to our heart is trying to prioritize seed-grown plants, which help build that genetic diversity, which further sort of underscores and promotes that resilience to change. Having plants that are genetically, have different adaptations for a variety of future conditions. Um, and that we can plug at the end. So Maura, I think we can go on to questions. I'll stop sharing.
Perfect. All right. So we'll start with some of the questions participants sent in ahead of time. So this first one is from Diane Testa, who asks, can I have an inexpensive water feature on my property if there are no natural springs or ponds without investing in an expensive pump and filtration system?
Um, yeah, so I mean, I don't, Emily, you maybe know a lot more about this space. I'll let you answer too, but my sort of instinct is a bird bath would really fit the bill there. And if you're willing, a lot of people will put a much smaller pump than what you might be used to for a pond to get some bubbling in that bird bath, can probably help keep it a little less stagnant, help prevent mosquito larvae from growing, and might make it a little bit more attractive, both to have some sound going on and maybe a little bit more attractive for birds. So that's kind of my initial thought is a just a simple bird bath.
Yeah, bird baths are really a great first step. And like Tyler said, keeping them clean is really important. Birds, there's a lot of diseases out there that they can transmit when they're all landing in the same area and feeding and drinking out of the same area. Same thing goes for bird feeders. You got to keep them clean. Um, and then the other option would be to dig a small pond. And there's several ways you can do that. They sell like solid plastic liners. That's what we're doing currently, trying to build a couple of those at our seed center in Cape Elizabeth. But a lot of people also will dig a hole and use kind of like a pool liner. There's plenty of like how-tos on YouTube about how to do it. The big things to think about if you're trying to build something like that is to make sure you have some kind of water flow because algae and gunk builds up really quickly. And being aware of your depth if you're somewhere that things freeze, and thinking about what types of creatures might end up living there. And if they're able to be dispersed or not. You don't necessarily want to build a vernal pool if you're not ready to deal with the activities of a vernal pool. But yeah, having some sort of pump or water movement will be really important. And if you want to plant it, you have to think about adding sand and rocks and things like that. But yeah, there's a bunch of tutorials on small ones. And if you don't want to dig it down, they you can do like above ground basin kind of people will get those like horse trough type things. And you can do like aquatic plantings in them. But same thing, you're going to want some sort of bubbler or pump or something like that to keep the water moving to prevent mosquitoes from being there. No fun.
Lori added that birds do love a drip from a hose into the bird bath too to keep things flowing, which is a really cute image. Um, great. So kind of along
I'll
the
also note if you're going to do bird baths, they sell little heaters that are really useful so that you can have water year round for birds because they also need water in the winter. Yeah.
along the bird train of thought, someone asks, what is a good reference source for making bird houses?
Emily, have you made birdhouses?
I
Have.
have. I have made birdhouses. I'm also very into birds, for those of you who don't know me. Um, and so the best source that I have for making birdhouses is the All About Birds. Cornell's lab has a whole bunch of really great information on the right way to make birdhouses. So thanks, Maura, for throwing that in there. And it talks about both the size of all your panels and also the hole size. So the hole size of your birdhouse is going to affect what birds want to go in it, and that's really helpful for highly competitive birds. So, for example, bluebirds, if you can keep the right size hole for them, it can help prevent other birds from coming in and killing their babies. It also gives really good information on what direction to put your birdhouse, like south facing for, cold climates is good. And it goes over all the different places. There's even like great horned owls and things like that tend to use old posts. So you build this like cone shaped thing and like put it put it in a crutch of a tree and then put a bunch of sticks in it and it can get great horned owls. So it's really fun. Some of them are really complex. So like purple martins, we'd eat if you have a space and the type of area that purple martins would live in, think about buying or building a purple martin house because they really need it. They're rapidly declining and they're connecting that with lack of housing for those creatures. So uh, it's really fun to do. Yeah. Yeah, so thanks, Adrian. Bird houses also need to be cleaned out. And if you want to get really involved, there are like monitoring programs. So if there's certain species that you're creating a bird house for uh, that usually Cornell or somebody like that has some monitoring programs, and you can keep an eye on like when they fledge and help with some like community science things. But most people will clear them out in the winter so that they can rebuild. But you don't have to do it quite as fast. And there are, yeah, the house sparrow will move in, so it's good to keep an eye on them. But I always say like don't get too upset if like say a tree swallow or something like that outcompetes a bluebird. That is just like, part of life. It gets a little bit more complicated when it's in an introduced species, but yeah, and just note that a lot of birds are protected by the Migratory Species Act. So I hear a lot about cowbirds. If a cowbird takes over your birdhouse, it's allowed to. That is the only way it can reproduce and survive. I know it seems rough, but that's nature. So let it do its thing.
All right, these next two questions kind of go hand in hand, so I'll ask them together. But Janet is wondering if you can talk a bit about soil health and biodiversity of native plants versus lawn. And the follow-up question is, what's the best way to eradicate grass or lawn grass?
Yeah, so the way I like to think in terms of the soil biodiversity question is, and if you hear crying, apologies, that is my 1-year-old daughter. She is exhausted this time of night. Um, but what I like to think about is like a lawn doesn't have very deep roots and it has sort of limited amount of things that it adds to the soil in terms of food that detritivores or things that break down dead stuff can use to food for food. Whereas more biodiverse native planting will provide a lot of different forms of food that are easy to break down, hard to break down, different nutrients. And so, just like that goldenrod example, it provides the foundation for a much more diverse food web in the soil. And so, in that way, it's really important. And even beyond the things that you can see, um, soil microbial life is they've found scientists have found that it's a lot more diverse in meadow plantings or plantings that have a higher diversity of native plants. So along those lines of like getting rid of lawn, I wouldn't say I wouldn't say it would permanently or eradicate the lawn necessarily, but there are several really effective um, ways that you can do it. My favorite is simply the cardboard method or sheet mulching method, where you're putting down a layer or two of non-coated cardboard with tape removed and leaving it there at least for 3 months, preferably a whole growing season. If it's like full sun, really lush lawn. If it's patchy or a little bit thinned out lawn, you can usually get away with a shorter amount of time. And if it's especially sparse, you can sometimes just get away with stopping mowing it and filling in with natives, particularly competitive native species that will eventually push it out. But the sheet mulching method is really great. Another one is to solarize if you're in a full sun spot, putting down black plastic for, again, 3 months, preferably the hottest time of the year, will sometimes be even a faster method to kill the lawn. And the idea is to keep the lawn there. The sod will sort of act as a nice mulch layer that then you can plant into after the lawn is dead. So those are two. There's more methods, but those are two organic methods that we like.
The only thing that I will add is if you have a large section, I like to do it in like if you have a large lawn, I like to do things in smaller sections. So rather than trying to remove like your whole acre plus or something of lawn, take it in chunks and then you can plant. And I find like we're using the black plastic at Turkey Hill, and we find it lasts for several seasons. So we just will like pull it up once the grass is killed, be able to plant and like flip it onto the next patch of grass. And that way you're using fewer resources at a time and you're able to actually plant as you prepare your site. And it saves some money and some effort in the long run.
We're almost at answering the next question anyhow. Um, this person asks if you have tips on letting lawn grow specifically into a meadow and how best to do that, whether that be scattering seeds or planting seedlings. And I do know we have a great Wild Seed Project article, so I'll link that as well.
Yeah, this is a very popular question, and so definitely check out if you haven't already that resource that Mara will share. Um, Yeah, so like we were already sort of talking about with the sort of the removing the lawn step or killing the lawn step, that is the first step that you would do, and ideally you would do that the year before you start your meadow planting. So typically I would recommend doing the sheet mulching or solarizing over the summer while you grow out or source your plant plugs that you would then put in the fall. Um, the problem with direct sowing seed, especially in this case, is if you have the sod still there, it's going to be it's going to make it harder for the seeds to really make soil contact, unless you do a really good job of raking that turf after it's dead, to make sure that you remove some of that litter from the top, some of the dead grass, so that the seed that you sow in the fall can actually make contact with the soil. Um, that being said, that's one method that you can do. I prefer to plant, so to grow using um, the way that we like to do it, which is sow into pots in the fall. And, this time of year they start to germinate. You up plant pot them during the summer. And then you have, plugs or 4-inch pots in the fall that you can directly plant into the area where your lawn used to be. That's the most effective, not only because your seeds will go farther, they'll have a lot better chance of germinating and surviving, being a little bit more babied in the pots than if you direct sow them. They'll experience less rodents eating them and other sort of things that can reduce success. And then also by planting them in the fall, you don't have to care for them like you would if you plant them in the spring or summer, right? They won't require the weeding during the dormant season or the watering or any sort of care. So it's pretty low maintenance to plant in the fall. And by planting them the following spring when they all come up, it'll be much better positioned to combat the weeds that will come in. So you will definitely have weeds there, even if your lawn was 100% lawn and it looked, totally monoculture. There are dozens and dozens of different species of weed that are just waiting for their chance. And so that will definitely happen. And it doesn't mean you can't direct sow, but you'll have a much easier time and probably a more successful time by planting actual plugs or small plants in the fall. And that's kind of just the beginning. As the article gets into other stuff like how do you maintain the meadow? That's very important. Um, and sort of other things that you might kind of encounter as you continue to create your meadow. So definitely recommend giving that a read.
Great. Anything to add, Emily?
I guess the only thing that I would add is consider if you have just a large section of lawn. I say this all the time, but think about adding some shrubs. They're pretty easy to just plant into lawn if they're well established. And what I like to do is I like to dig my hole, plant my shrub, and then do a little bit of sheet mulch as like kind of a buffer around that planting. And that will kind of establish a start to where you can start planting. And once the shrub grows up, it'll start to kill some of that lawn down with the shade that it produces. And there's plenty of good meadow shrub species that are nice to start with.
All right, we've got some people interested in wasps, which is very exciting. So we'll start with a question from Suzanne Hamilton first, who says she saw, they saw a parasitoid wasp on their window the other evening using an ID app. Usually seeing the word parasitic in the name, you automatically think undesirable or bad, but that may not be the correct way of thinking. Are parasitic wasps necessary for increasing biodiversity?
You have any-
Oh, oh, of course I want to go. I love wasps. If nothing else, I just want everyone else to love wasps too. Um, and yeah, parasitic wasps in general are so important to our ecosystems, to our biodiversity, to pest control. People, a lot of the information out there about planting for animals thinks of planting these plants to get caterpillars for birds, right? And that's because birds eat a lot of arthropods. So they do benefit from us planting these, but the number one thing that's controlling potential pest populations of things like grasshoppers or caterpillars or things that feed on plants are wasps. They are really doing the bulk of that population control. So without them, we're in some real damage here. We're going to lose a lot of plants to overfeeding and competition and things like that. So first of all, wasps are super important for that. And then there's another layer about parasitoid wasps in general are um, they've evolved very, very close relationships with the species they parasitize. So most of them are incredibly host specific, and they really, really need those species to be around. So when you think parasite, a lot of times we think like ticks or leeches or something that's like just going to bite everybody. But when it comes to wasps and parasitoid wasps, they have very specified relationships with their host plant. So they're really not a problem. They're actually the opposite of a problem. They're incredibly important, and they're keeping evolution moving. They're keeping populations in check, and they are to be loved. And they're really fascinating. So if you can figure out, what species it is, you can figure out that means what you've got some other species around that it is targeting, and you can go like down the food chain and really follow their life. There's also like hyperparasitoids and egg parasitoids. The smallest creature the smallest animal in the world is a wasp. It is the fairy wasp. It is a tiny little parasitoid. So yeah, they're very cool.
Yeah, and I'll just add that um, parasites in many ways are like a sign that the ecosystem is healthy, like it has the biodiversity and the host species in healthy enough numbers that parasites are able to um, to exist and thrive and all of that. So it's actually a really nice sign when you see it.
Great. Now that we've all fallen in love with wasps, even the parasitic ones, Evan Robbins is wondering how they can best attract them. And the question is, would the choices for creating a wasp garden be different than creating a generally biodiverse pollinator garden where any given pollinator is a potential host?
Yeah, so planting a pollinator garden is going to bring those parasitoids, like Tyler just said, they are a sign of a healthy ecosystem or a healthy high biodiversity functioning ecosystem. There are certain plants that seem to attract wasps more, and Maura will put the link in there. Heather Holm is kind of the wasp person in North America, and she's done a lot of really great research about native plants and the wasps that are associated with them. Um, Other things that you can do to help attract wasps are several of our really cool wasps are ground digging wasps, which means they need nesting habitat. So just like with any wildlife, any living thing, you need to provide food, water, shelter, nesting areas. That goes for all of us humans as well. Um, and some of these really cool, like the great golden digger wasp is one of my personal favorite wasps. And they need to excavate kind of sandy soil. So if you can have some bare, dry spots on your property, it's really great habitat for those sort of wasps. Also, many of our native bees require that sort of habitat. So providing some open, bare ground can help as well. But yeah, if you find the right plants to attract the host for those wasps, you'll get more wasps. But then also, wasps are really cool because they're beneficial on many levels. Most of them are predators when they're in their larval form. So the adults will sting whatever their host is. Say it's a grasshopper or a spider, they'll sting it, paralyze it. They'll bring it back to their nest, and their larva will feed on that and grow. But then when they become an adult, they become pollinators. So they go after nectar, and there's some really great nectar resources. Some of them seem to really like swamp milkweed. I've noticed some of the really large ones seem to go to that plant. But yeah, check out Heather Holmes. She has a book out that came out a couple years ago called just Wasps, and I love it. It's really beautiful.
Great. All right, we've got several plant-specific questions, and this one's catching my eye just because we've been growing them ourselves. But Gwen writes, I'm downsizing and recently planted a few seed-grown Jack in the Pulpit in the New Hampshire home garden, and they're doing very well. They would like to move a few of them to their new property in Maine. The plants are very developed. Any suggestions on when to move and any advice on the best way to do that?
I can take that one first, unless you want to, Tyler.
You can go ahead.
Yeah. Um, Jack in the pulpits are notoriously annoying to try to transplant. The big thing is that they tend to get pretty associated with the mycorrhizae that they are growing in. Um, so I think if you're going to try to move them, try to take as much soil as you can from that property with them to the area you plant them. Um, and then if they are producing fruits, if they produce fruit before you move, try to get some of those too, because if you can um, establish them. If the seed source that you used in both locations is the same and they're growing in both, you should be okay with them. Um, but yeah, try to get some of that mycorrhizae soil.
All right. The next question about a plant-specific thing is from Brian Doring, who has shortbush and tallbush blueberries on their property. Would it be bad to plant additional new wild blueberry bushes with them, or should they just focus on cultivating what is naturally there and promoting their growth?
Um, I I mean, I think my recommendation would be if you want to add more to your sort of collection or have some more cultivated ones to um, seek out more local suppliers as best you can. I don't see any issue with adding. I'm not sure if you're specifically interested in cultivated varieties, cultivated for taste and that sort of thing, or if you just want to add more straight species to your spot. But especially if it's straight species and you're getting it more locally, if you're in Maine, getting them from Fedco or some other good, reputable native plant nursery. And we have a resource on our website for finding, depending on what state you live in, good native plant nurseries in your area. But I think, yeah, I think that's completely fine. They're not, I don't know, Emily could maybe um, talk about how easy or not it is to sort of vegetatively propagate ones that you have on your property. That might be an easy route. I'm not quite sure, but yeah, that's kind of my initial read.
Yeah, I wouldn't think there'd be a problem with planting new ones. The only thing that I would think about or try to look into is when you're getting especially low bush blueberry. Um, Many times the ones offered are ones that were dug from the wild, or you could get like blueberry sod and stuff like that, and those are usually wild dug, which can be pretty problematic. So just make sure you're getting them from somewhere good. As far as propagating them, they're not easy to do. They're easy to divide. If you have like a really tight one, you can dig them up and move them around. That's not too hard. But doing cuttings is tricky. It's doable. But yeah, look up research on how to do it. Michael Durr has some good woody propagation information. So check out his books.
Great. Someone else writes, if I need male and female plants to produce berries like ilex, how do I do that when starting from seeds or buying at native species, or sorry, or is buying at native nurseries the only way to do so?
I mean, grow in numbers would be, I think, unfortunately, really the only way you can do it until they're to flowering age. Um, there's got to be a good number though in terms of probability, right? Like maybe five gets you to that like high enough probability that is the best bang for your buck. But yeah, in my experience, like Garden of the Woods, native plant trusts, um, they will have sexed most of their woody shrubs as long as they are able to do so. And so that's a handy way if you're looking for a specific female or male shrub to seek them out that way.
Yeah, there's no way to know until they're flowering. So that's at a pretty old age. Otherwise, you can, take cuttings of known ones and propagate them. They aren't too hard to propagate from cuttings. Um, and that makes it a little bit easier. And if you're not feeling like going to a garden center and getting a cultivar, I know I have in the past found that I had probably all females, and it's pretty easy. You only really need one male. So you can just go get like a Jim Dandy or something like that from the garden centers, if you end up with mostly females. Otherwise, yeah, time will tell.
Great. Next question is, I think, a common one. But after eliminating aggressive plants that have kind of created a monoculture in a yard, what's the best way to diversify after removal?
So did they mention that these were like non-native aggressive plants or just
Yeah, yep.
no? Um, yeah, I'm sure Maura can add our it's mostly a species list of native plants that we recommend, rugged native plants for replacing non-native aggressive species. But I would say probably the best to add, and Emily mentioned this earlier, was shrubs to add some shrubs to the space as much as possible. Those will do the best job in terms of keeping other weeds from coming up and, competing with other stuff that might make the process more difficult. So that list of rugged species will give you a lot of different ideas of shrubs that you could put in that spot. Um, our guide also has uh, a specific sort of section on or a community of keen competitor plants, which are those ones that I mentioned that are particularly competitive and fast growing. So, you might think about your coneflowers or sunflowers or um, spireas, some of those sort of herbaceous plants. If you're in a more full sun part shade spot, that will do really well about in terms of multiplying and spreading by rhizome and really doing a good job of taking up space pretty quickly. So those are, if you don't have a particular aesthetic or type of garden that you're going for, you mostly want to restore it to natives and prevent weedy growth and those non-native aggressive species from coming back. That would be, I think, the quickest and sort of easiest way to go about it is a mixture of shrubs and those um, highly competitive um, herbaceous or wildflower species.
All right, thank you. I think that our next question is about if I have a mostly forested area, what's the best way to support oh my goodness. If I have a forested area, how can I still support biodiversity?
Emily, do you want to talk about forest pollinators?
Yeah, I'll start and then feel free to share whatever you're thinking. Yeah, I've been ranting a lot about forests because I think they don't get enough credit as their importance for biodiversity, especially in the Northeast. We hear a lot about people wanting to build these meadows for their pollinators and creating pollinator gardens. And when we think of pollinator gardens, like myself included, we often think these full sun, big flowering gardens, right? But the habitats of the Northeast tend to be fairly wooded. We have small grasslands and things like that, but nothing like in the Midwest where there's these large meadows. So first of all, like most of our biodiversity prefers forest or forest edge habitats and things like that. So don't discount forests as something that are important for wildlife. On top of that, research is showing more and more that pollinators are really using forest canopies. We always think about we have to have these early spring blooms for the bees that are just emerging. We're seeing these andrenids, we're seeing these bumblebees, we're seeing things come out early right now. But it seems like nothing's blooming to somebody who's maybe thinking about looking for milkweeds or echinacea or things like that. But really, what's blooming are our trees. Our maples, our willows, things like that are doing a huge service to our pollinators. So providing those early spring blooms like that. shrub that I really love is spice bush. Great replacement for things like forsythia because it has these beautiful yellow spring flowers. And not only do they help pollinators, but they also are a host plant to a really cool caterpillar. Um, but yeah, forests are really important. And having like those forest layers is really important. Really one of the most biodiverse areas or like life-bringing areas in the Northeast and New England are edge habitats. They're where I see the most birds. They're my favorite birding locations. And that's because they have that canopy, understory, and these ground covers. They tend to be kind of that mix of shade and sunny areas. Yeah, thank you. Maura threw in here. I just want to plug Xerces Society. They're pretty much the only invertebrate uh, protection nonprofit out there. So they have really, really great information on invertebrates. And this little YouTube discusses some research coming out now about how important forest canopies are for pollinators. So other things that you can do though is make sure that you have an ongoing understory layer. So something that I've noticed really quite prevalently in the Northeast is the loss of our understory. And some of that is because of these introduced species that are highly aggressive and outcompeting others. And they, when those are removed, which a lot of people have gotten into, invasive species removal, but then they don't necessarily think of replanting. And even if they haven't been removed, very quickly, all you have is a monoculture of a species that's not going to produce biodiversity. So thinking about adding shade-loving shrubs, shade-loving ground covers, things like what Tyler was saying in the beginning, things that are going to bloom for multiple seasons. So something like geraniums for early season ground cover, and then things like tall anemones for later season flowering in shade, and then so many asters and goldenrods can do both. And then having your that's your ground cover layer, and then thinking about your understory layer with shrubs. Yep, dogwoods are really, really great. Yeah, there's a whole slew of cool woodland shrubs. If you want a late season flowering thing, witch hazel is really cool. Um, I could go on and on, but there's some really great ones. I'm sure we have some good shrub links out there. Also, we have a whole shrub guide, so check that out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the only thing I would add is on the sort of caterpillar front, so many tree species are keystone species or species that have a disproportionate, positive benefit on wildlife value and sort of food webs and ecological health. So when you think about trees, they represent so much food, right? There's such a volume of leaves up there, and all of that is incredibly valuable for so many butterfly and moth species and a bunch of other insects. Um, so yeah, definitely undervalued. And one of the most threatened ecosystems in the Northeast is early successional forests. So forests that have experienced some disturbance, or maybe there's a gap that allows some light in, but those sorts of forests are like edge habitats, really incredibly important because they have multiple layers, and there's so much sort of diversity of plant life available um, for insects and wildlife. So yeah.
All right, I think we have time for maybe two more, maybe just one. We've had a couple questions about bee hotels, bee boxes, things like that. So first, someone is wondering, when's the best time to clean a bee hotel if they've already moved in? And the second question is about leaf cutter bee boxes, and if you have two semi-optimum locations, how do you choose which is the least detrimental or the most beneficial?
Yeah, I'll do the leaf cutter one first because it's a little easier. They don't tend to go to places that aren't gonna be the best habitat for them. I mean, it doesn't hurt to try. Worst case, you just get nothing. But that's more likely what you'll get. For bee hotels, so I have very mixed feelings about bee hotels. Um, for one thing, they kind of encourage a higher density than most of the species that would use them would use in the wild, which can be problematic for disease spread. That's one of the big issues that come in there. Things like chalk brood, and it's really sad. A lot of this, unfortunately, comes from the honeybees. Um, Mixing up disease on flowers, and then it gets brought back to these like congregate living situations, as we all know quite a bit about these days. And it can spread disease a lot easier. So on that, if you are going to do them, really think about cleaning them when there's no insects in there. So if you've already got them in, you have to wait until they've emerged. Usually that's around fall. Yeah, we put in a couple useful fact sheets on how to build them and how to make sure you're changing them out. So really you have to keep an eye on emergence. You'll be able to see the hole that they came out of. Generally they're done in the fall, but really just keep an eye on them. And it's best to, if you are noticing some sort of disease, to fully replace your little tubes every year so that you're not continuing to spread any disease rather than trying to like clean the holes. That's going to be a lot harder. But then your actual frame, you can do a bleach solution and clean it out.
Great. All right, I think we'll ask one more question and then Tyler will let you do your last guide plug. But our last question, someone's wondering, I've seen some na more native plants available in big box stores at a more affordable price point. Is that still a valuable option for increasing biodiversity in a yard?
I'm sure we both have many thoughts on this. I'll just say, I mean, on one hand, it is good that the awareness is spreading and that clearly customers are asking and demanding more native plants. That's awesome, and that's definitely a direction that we want to see it go. Um, Part of what usually is available at big box stores are either cultivars or species that are, even if they're not labeled as cultivars, will typically be, cuttings or tissue culture or some sort of method of vegetatively or essentially cloning the plant. And when you think about all the big box stores selling the same cloned plant, it really starts to be quite the sad story for genetic diversity. There just is a lot less of it. So it's a little bit of a one step forward, two steps back in some ways. The other thing is if it's particular cultivars will have, say, changes to leaf color, and Emily can talk more about this, but or there'll be like bloodroot. There are cultivars that are double petaled or entirely all petals and no stamens, pollen producing stamens. So they provide no food for pollinators. And that's the reason why they bloom so long is because the flower never gets fertilized, and so it just blooms and blooms and blooms. Those sorts of things are, um, yeah, they're just not as valuable, right? And so we try and share some of those big downsides with um, some of the native plants that are available in these bigger box stores.
Yeah, yeah. So the bottlenecking of genes is always a concern. We've seen that really affect things when things like diseases come through. You tend to lose the whole species. The other thing that's really important to think about with the box stores is that they tend to be producing all of their plants from the same place, and that tends to be quite far from wherever they're sold. It's usually in the southern states, southern Midwest. So right there, you're probably not going to get a well adapted to your region plant, um, because it's used to being grown in these like perfect conditions down somewhere warm and different. They're also often treated with pesticides, and the last thing we want to do is try to attract insects and then just kill them because there's pesticides on the plants. Um, Especially things like neonicotinoids, that highly impact. They were the thing that got shifted because they were considered a safer pesticide because they were low impact to vertebrates, but they are very high impact to invertebrates. So they really affect bees on a neurological basis. Yeah, I mean, they're a pesticide, they kill insects. Um, so really avoiding those. I'm hopeful that the push to the native plant industry also pushes to a no pesticide industry. Maybe we can hope if we keep pushing for that. Another thing is just these big box stores aren't benefiting your community, right? So if we're buying from local growers, we're benefiting both our local economy, our neighbors, people that are actually doing the work to grow the plants, so they know them a lot better, they care a lot better, more about them. Um, and that I think is a really important note. And then yeah, quickly on the cultivars. The thing about cultivars, and I get this question all the time, and someday we'll do a whole panelist Q&A just about cultivars for folks. But really the thing we want to think about is the trait that was selected for that cultivar, and different traits are going to have different effects on what can use the plant. Um, what we've found is, for example, things like plants that have been selected for having red leaves tend to deter insect feeding. That makes sense. Red pigments are insect deterrents. So like the Diablo 9 bark is probably not going to be as beneficial as a green leafed one. Um, some seem to show no real difference, which can be really beneficial if we're thinking about disease-resistant plants. So when I was doing my research on cultivars, we found that the disease-resistant elms could still feed the specialists that were finding them, which is really important because then we don't have elms, right? Without that. So it's really important to think about that and do your research. It's also great, like the plants that had been selected to be slightly smaller still attracted things, which is really nice for folks who don't have as much space but want to bring in more diversity. So I kind of think of it as like levels, like a straight species wild type plant that you grew from seed is going to be like your biggest bang for your buck. It's going to do the most. But that doesn't mean cultivars aren't still going to be better than a monoculture lawn. They're not going to, they're still doing a lot of work. So really picking and choosing and finding out what works best for you, and really understanding those trait changes that have been selected for, and trying to get all your levels of diversity down to the genetics.
Great. All right, so we are a little
I just have a
over.
few thoughts on that.
I
Um,
a bold question to end on. But Tyler, I know you have one last thing you want to say before we log off. Thanks to everyone for sticking around.
yeah. And Gwen, if you're still around, those are the same, hog peanut and ground peanut, different common names. Yeah, I just wanted to give a quick plug for we're having a book launch. We created a book and we want to celebrate. So on May 22nd, it's a Thursday from 6 to 7, we will be at Back Cove Books in Portland. Um, please stop by if you're interested. We'd love to meet you and chat about anything native plant related. Um, and yeah, the only thing is please go to backcovebooks.com/events to RSVP. That's helpful for us to know the overall size of the event. So hope to see you there.
All right, just a reminder, this was recorded, so we'll get that sent out to you. But thanks to everyone for joining and especially for sticking around. And hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.